Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session of the Conversations on South Asia series. My name is Kirk Gambetta. I am the faculty coordinator for this year's Conversation series, as well as a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows here at Dartmouth and a lecturer in their history department. So, to give a little bit of background about the series for those who don't know, the Conversation series is hosted by faculty in the South Asian Studies Collective here at Dartmouth, each of whom select books published during the past 2 years for us to discuss and reflect on publicly in the context of a webinar. So we're really excited today to be hosting a conversation about Sudev Sheth's new book, Bankrolling Empire, Family Fortunes and Political Transformation in Mughal India, published in 2023 by Cambridge University Press. Following introductions by Professor Emeritus Douglas Haynes from the Department of History, Sudev Sheth will begin by presenting his book and sharing a summary of it, after which Nandini Chatterjee and Chunhui Ko will present their responses to the book. After this, we will have an open discussion in which we welcome questions and conversation from all of you participants. So before proceeding with today's book conversation, I want to make a few announcements and acknowledgments. First, I want to make everyone aware of two other sessions in our Winter Conversation series. On January 30th, we will discuss Martin Saxer's new book, Places and Knots, Remoteness and Connectivity in the Himalayas. On February 27th, we will then turn to Sri Rupa Roy's new book, The Political Outsider, Curative Democracy and the Lineages of Populism. So please note that we have shifted to Thursdays at 12:15 p.m. instead of Tuesdays, as was the case in the past, and this will be the case going forward. Do look for sign-up information in our email correspondence, on our website, and in our social media accounts, Instagram and Twitter, for announcements about events in the coming spring quarter. So I would also like to thank our sponsors for the event, the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages, and the Bodhis Fund for South Asian Programming at Dartmouth. Thank you as well to our two Bodhis student fellows, Navya Bharadwaj and Mritala Sarvanan, for helping organize today's conversation. Lastly, thank you to Hope Rennie in the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages for all of her help with the series, without which none of this would be possible. So one overall reminder to webinar attendees, please leave your comments in the Q&A box, not the chat. We want to make sure to see your questions and respond to them promptly. So please put them in the Q&A box. So before proceeding with the presentations, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's session, Douglas Haynes. Douglas Haynes is Professor Emeritus of History at Dartmouth College, where he taught courses on South Asian history, environmental history, Gandhi, and comparative colonialism. He is a specialist on the economic and business history of Western India and has written on a wide range of issues, such as small-scale industry, advertising, global business in India, the middle class and middle class conjugality, sexual science, consumption and marketing, and managerial capitalism. He's currently working on a study about the early graduates of the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and their role in Indian business before 1990. With that, I will let Doug introduce today's speakers and respondents. Thanks, Doug.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. I hope I'm audible. Welcome everyone to the discussion of Sudev's wonderful book. I was very pleased myself to have a chance to comment on the book in a similar occasion at Brown in the fall. So I'm very interested to hear what others have to say about it. I wanted to remind everybody of the format here. Sudev will open with an overview of his book for 10 to 12 minutes, and that will be followed by comments from Nandini and Chunhui for 10 minutes. And then we'll open things up for questions. And again, to repeat what Kurt said, please place your questions and comments in the Q&A box, and we'll raise them after the commentators go. I'm going to
Doug, sorry to interrupt you, but one thing I just noticed is that Sudev is still sharing his screen from before, and I think probably, Sudev, you might want people to first See you as a presenter.
Oh,
Yes. Sorry,
yes.
I just
Okay.
noticed that, everyone.
Yeah, I
All
was
right.
wondering. Yeah.
No problem, no
Um,
problem.
I'm going to introduce all the speakers first and let them speak in order rather than intervene between the different speakers. So um, I will go with Sudev first. Dr. Sudev Sheth is a senior lecturer in history at the Joseph H.R. Lauder Institute of Management and International Studies and in the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches across the School of Arts and Sciences and the Wharton School. He was previously on the faculty at Harvard Business School, where he held the Harvard Newcomen Fellowship in Business History. His writings have appeared in top academic journals and popular outlets, including The Conversation, Economic and Political Weekly, Mint, Knowledge at Wharton, and Harvard Business Publishing. Dr. Sheth received a PhD in History and South Asia Studies from the University of Pennsylvania, an MA in History from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and a BA in South and Southeast Asian Studies with an award-winning thesis on music from the University of California, Berkeley. Nandini Chatterjee will go first among our commentators. Uh, she is professor of Indian history and culture at the University of Oxford. She works on law and society in South Asia during the colonial period, as well as under the Mughal Empire, and especially focuses on law and cultural exchanges between Mughals and the British. Her published work includes the 2020 monograph Negotiating Mughal Law, A Family of Landlords Across Three Empires. And she was a participant in our conversation series earlier, as she mentioned. Her book, which was awarded the Peter Gonville Stein Prize by the American Society for Legal History, was based on a completely reconstructed archive of Persian language historical documents. Professor Chatterjee is one of the editors of the English Historical Review and is currently editing a six-volume series on the cultural history of South Asia for Bloomsbury Academic, covering all periods of South Asian history. Uh, so Chun-Hui Ko is assistant professor of history at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her book, The Sublime Post, How the Ottoman Imperial Post Became a Public Service, 2024, examines how early modern Ottoman state formation examines early modern state formation through the lens of its relay postal system. Our work has won various prizes, including the Jack Goody Article Prize 2023 for The Mystery of the Missing Horses, the Berkshire Conference Article Prize 2022, honorable mention for the Ottoman Postmaster, and the Malcolm Kurd Dissertation Prize in Social Sciences by the Middle East Studies Association in 2020. Before doing her PhD, Professor Ko studied at the American University of Beirut, the National University of Singapore, Delhi University, and the University of Arizona. And at UCLA, she's a member of the Ottoman Musical Ensemble, where she plays the goblet drum. That the music is a common feature between her and our author today. With that, let's Sudev begin his summary, and then we'll go on to the other two commentators.
Well, first, big thank you to Kurt and colleagues at Dartmouth for the kind invitation. And of course, to Professor Doug Haynes, who I've known for many years now, first as a graduate student, someone who I met and have been inspired by. You're a pioneer in business history of South Asia and have sort of paved the way for a younger generation of scholars to think about the connection between business, economy, and society. So thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be here. And also to Nandini Chatterjee and Chunhui, who are, both colleagues, friends, and mentors in a way. I mean, especially Nandini Chatterjee, who's a leading light in Mughal studies, very kind to young scholars, and has inspired a whole generation of us to think differently about the Mughal Empire and to bring new perspectives. So it is in that spirit that I'll take the next 10 minutes or so to outline the major arguments of my book. And rather than jumping into a straight academic talk with arguments and interventions, let me begin by sharing how I actually came to this particular topic. And let me make sure my share screen works as well. So let's just give it a go here. And because I can see Chunhui, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Okay, perfect, great. So I began this project several years ago when I was pursuing a master's degree in New Delhi at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. As a young, impressionable student, I arrived in Delhi thinking I would work on modern Indian history, which is really 19th and 20th century, but I couldn't help notice relics of a bygone era from an earlier period in my immediate surroundings. So as I motorcycled around New Delhi, from monument to monument, attending, various music festivals, which often take place in old monuments, and also visiting museums in the city, I couldn't help but be attracted to an earlier imperial formation, that is the Mughal Empire. So if you look at your screen here, I was privileged enough to spend some time in Fatehpur Sikri, not too far from Delhi. Taj Mahal, also not very far from New Delhi. And of course, some of the visual relics of the bygone, which are paintings from the Mughal period here. You see Akbar hanging out with Jesuits in the court in the 16th century, and then of course my favorite, which is imperial feasting and music in the Mughal court. So again, as I was thinking about building a project, even though I was studying modern South Asian history, which unfortunately in India, history is still taught through a tripartite division. Either you're an ancient historian, a medieval historian, or a modernist, and the twain rarely ever meet. I was very fortunate to be sort of encouraged by colleagues and scholars and professors at JNU to take classes in medieval South Asian history. So that's how I found myself taking classes on the Mughal Empire. And let me say a bit about the Mughal Empire for those who are less familiar with it. So the Mughal Empire is really a large land-based agrarian polity that emerges in the 16th century. And it emerges as a group of Central Asian warrior elites make their way into South Asia. One in particular, Babur, is the most well known for sort of establishing the roots of the Mughal Empire. His early years hanging out, that he heard about the riches and wealth of India, of Hindustan and proper, and he decided to kind of try his luck at subduing parts of the subcontinent. So by his fifth attempt in 1526, he arrives in northern India and is not particularly pleased with the environment of South Asia. If you look at his memoirs, he says that the environment's very tough, it's humid, weapons don't last very long, houses are crumbling, there are no warm baths to be had, and unfortunately, the fruits of India are not as good as those of Central Asia. So he's very fond of his homeland, but yet he notices something that sets him apart from other entrepreneurs of the time period. I'm using the word entrepreneur very loosely here, but they're essentially military warlords who are curious to build resources and capacity. So what does he notice? He notices the fact that Hindustan at the time has sophisticated counting systems. And for him, this is proxy enough for the immense wealth that is to be had in the subcontinent. And he gambled correctly. So, he sort of realizes that this is the place to be. Even though half of his retainers go back to Central Asia, he decides to stay back and start building the sort of the foundations of what would later be known as the Mughal Empire. It is his grandson, Akbar, the most well-known Mughal emperor, who uses a combination of effective warfare, effective diplomacy, marriage as a form of alliance, and administrative tactics to kind of build up the capacity of the Mughal Empire and sort of sets the foundation for this particular lineage. Now, while I'm very excited about the high tide of the Mughal Empire, and if you see the map here on your left, you'll notice that it kind of covers a good amount of space at its peak in the 17th century. What really captured my imagination as a young student in Delhi is what happened to this formation, this massive political organization that many scholars have spilled considerable ink writing about, talking about its administrative apparatus, talking about its nobility, talking about how empire expanded and kind of subdued groups along its way. Rather than thinking about the high tide of the Mughal Empire, I was much more curious about what happened to this particular formation. Where did it go? If the monuments and stories remain with us, what were the mechanisms by which the empire actually dissipated or experienced dissolution? So rather than tell you how I felt through words, let me just play a 20 or 30-second clip to give you a visual sense of what captured my imagination. So here's the Mughal Empire in the late 17th century. And you'll notice that in its quest to expand southward towards the Deccan, you will see a really curious process by which its existing strongholds in northern India start to experience decay and dissolution. So that by the 18th century, what you really see is a Mughal empire experiencing quick atrophy, and in its wake, new groups coming up, asserting authority, claiming resources, and trying to assert some new form of sovereignty in the vacuum left behind by the Mughal Empire. So it is this kind of visual that inspired me to take on a project that really tried to connect the high tide of the medieval period or Mughal history, which is the 16th and 17th centuries, with what comes afterward, which is the 18th century. Typically in Indian historiography, these are seen to be separate kind of spaces. Again, as I said, historians rarely speak across the 18th century divide. There are, of course, a handful of us who have been doing that for the last couple of decades, but really it's a small group of people, and I thought I could make some small contribution here through my work. So the big questions I was equipped with were, how did localities experience what imperial attrition looks like from a local perspective? And second, thinking about historical change, what processes enabled regional warlords and then leaders of the British East India Company to consolidate political power in the aftermath of the Mughal Empire? Another way of framing it is, how do you go from a world that looks like what you see on your left to a world by the mid-18th century where new regional political formations are emerging, to then finally by the early 19th century, a dizzying patchwork quilt of small and large political organizations that are claiming resources and authority across the subcontinent, right? So how do you go from a world where you have Mughal power that really almost seems like it's a wall-to-wall carpet in the 16th century and 17th century to one by, the early 18th and 19th century, you have a patchwork quilt of so many polities that are vying for some space. So some of these questions I try to tackle in my new book, Bankrolling Empire, which has a copyright date of 2024, actually. So it's a new book, and I'm excited to hear what people have to say about it and learn from critiques that will emerge as well. This is not the first or last word on it. This is just a word on the topic, and I'm really excited to see what others have to say. I believe that this topic is really relevant and interesting because we still haven't come to a conclusion for why and how the Mughal Empire collapsed. There are existing explanations. For example, some have argued that, the imperial ranking system, the ranking system of Jagir Mansab, which those who are specialists would be familiar with, was not adequate to solve new aspiring groups who wanted a piece of the pie. Others have argued that it was technologies in firearms that the Mughals failed to resolve. So, for example, not adopting handgun technology early enough was what led to their demise. And finally, my favorite explanation comes from Munis Faruqi at Berkeley, who has argued that it was actually the failure of the imperial household to maintain healthy political competition by way of brothers actually fighting for the throne and leading to fratricide. That institution atrophying, the idea of political competition ceasing, is what eventually led to the demise of the Mughal Empire. Now, while all of these explanations have some partial truths, I felt that we needed to think about new explanations, other forms of thinking about the topic. And it was a combination of good fortune and suggestions from senior scholars that have been able to identify a range of sources across linguistic registers that you can see here on the slide in front of you. And it is through a combination of these sources, especially the ones in red that you see here, that I identified a range of materials that spoke to what I think has been an understudied aspect of imperial formation, and that has to do with the finances of the Mughal Empire and its successor states. So unlike Western European societies or even early American societies where you have single repositories of big business families, think Medici's of Italy, think the Rothschilds of England and France, think the Fugers of Germany, and so on and so forth, we unfortunately do not have a single archive of a main banking family that we can turn to for an easy narrative about how money functioned and how private capitalists functioned during the high and low tide of the Mughal Empire. For that, you have to take a very different approach. You have to take sort of a literary historical approach. And here are the range of sources that I've been able to identify that have allowed me to start piecing together an alternative archive, kind of building on Nandini's work, thinking about how can you build your own archive? Can you build an alternative archive to think about some of the big questions of empire? So let me give you a quick sense of what these materials look like. So here you have a farman, which is a 17th century farman issued by a prince to a business family in Ahmedabad in Gujarat. This is a loan for 5.5 lakh rupees, which is 500,000 rupees approximately. To give you a sense of what that's worth, you can buy 10 kilograms of wheat for about 1 rupee. You can buy processed indigo for about 5 to 10 rupees. A slave would cost you 1 to 3 rupees. So 500,000 rupees is a very sizable sum. And what's key here for our purposes is that the sum was provided on the spot. So it's not relevant to have a lot of money over a 12-month cycle, but really having that money when you really need it. So this loan comes during an imperial war between two princes who are fighting for the throne in the mid-17th century. That's Persian language. Let me quickly give you two other source materials. One is a Sanskrit praise poem. It's a prashasti, which I analyze in one of the chapters in the book. But this is just to suggest that we have non-Persian language materials, which are very important for us to think about when we're building an argument. My favorite source here is the diary of a low-level Mughal bureaucrat, which, is about a 10-year time span that he covers, combining news reports in the locality, but also his own ethnographic observations about what he sees between Ahmedabad, Surat, Baroda, and other kind of localities in Gujarat. A very interesting source that allows us to see how business families and particular characters emerge in this kind of vacuum of 18th century decline and how we can understand change over time. Quickly, I want to just, in the last minute, tell you what the arguments are and who the main characters are. So I focus on the business family of Shantidas Jhaveri, who's a jeweler, and he and his sons and grandsons are involved in various levels of intrigue when it comes to the Mughal Empire. And what I tried to do, I'm going to just skip ahead in the interest of time, is map out how 4 generations of this particular family line up with Mughal political leaders. And in doing so, I advance an argument in the book which actually is framed around 4 different concepts. The first concept is courtly mutualism, which basically suggests that in the high tide of the Mughal Empire, these families shared a mutualistic relationship with the court. They provided luxury commodities, they provided goods and rarities, especially from the New World, and in return, their axes of commerce were protected by the Mughal state, including by local governors who tended to take their side in any local disputes. This shifts by the mid-17th century as new resources are needed by imperial households for political competition, and private wealth is identified as one major resource. And it is in this context that these families start providing capital by way of loans to rival princes. I suggest that by the early 18th century, this gives way to a more tantalizing phase in Mughal history, which is what I'm calling expedient extortion. It is in this phase that general coaxing and asking for loans gives way to straight up extortion, right? These families realize that this money is no longer going to be paid going forward. And in the whirlwind of Mughal decline in the 18th century, caused by overexpansion and administrative folly, these families are targeted for their wealth and are extorted for large sums of money in the locality. All of this ends in a kind of resolution in the 4th phase, what I'm calling competitive coparcenary. And this is simply, if you recall the map I showed you of the patchwork quilt of polities vying for authority, it is in this context that bankers emerge as kind of key nodes and key individuals in a new political landscape. If you can think about a political landscape that's pluralizing, that requires new tools to adjudicate claims that are much more complex. It is bankers, it is their wealth, and it is their networks that kind of emerges as a way of thinking about political futures, right? The idea that we're going to start carving out spaces and land and resources in 5, 10, 15-year horizons, what we call ijara in the local language, which is essentially forms of revenue farming, which emerge as a key way of adjudicating disputes and adjudicating claims for increasing authority. So to give away the final punchline, what I argue in the book, and I think this is interesting and new for from a Mughal history perspective, is that it is actually in the process of Mughal decline or Mughal decay that bankers are first implicated, then extorted, and then they finally adapt to new political circumstances to not only grow their businesses, but also use the power of finance and their networks to shape new political possibilities. So as I said, as the landscape pluralizes, the market required more nuanced tools to adjudicate between several competing political entrepreneurs, and contractual agreements backed by private capital, new financial instruments, and the idea of state debt emerge as the most prominent method of organizing South Asia political life in the 18th century. Now, it is a different matter altogether that the British eventually outlawed forms of indigenous banking by the late 19th century, and that's a whole nother topic of conversation. And of course, businesses had to sort of reorganize their entrepreneurial efforts once again in the late 19th century, but that's a tale for another time. For now, I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we'll have more time in the Q&A to tease out some of the threads that I've laid out for you here. Okay.
Doug, you're muted. Thank you, Sudev.
Professor Chatterjee.
Thank you very much. It is such a pleasure to actually return to this series of conversations, which, as Professor Haynes mentioned, I once had my own book discussed in. Sudev spoke of my association with his project in excessively kind terms. I see myself as more of a co-traveler with him because I do remember several, I think, Madison sessions in which we have actually looked at some of a very small proportion of his materials together. And I was already aware that something magnificent was about to come out of the other side. But indeed, this book went beyond what I could have imagined. It's really a magnificent book, and it bears saying several times. So I have because Sudev is one of the most conceptually and structurally clear speakers and writers that I have come across in recent times. I think this clarity allows me to be a little fuzzy in my turn and kind of use that fuzziness to kind of branch out in other directions with thoughts beyond this already magnificent book. So it's this conceptual clarity, I think, that kind of organizes this work. And Sudev, you set out by saying that you wanted to examine this thesis by Professor Karen Leonard, that it was the kind of re-articulation of the relationship between the Indian capitalists and the regimes that that characterizes this process of regime change from Mughals to the successor states and then colonialism. And you noted how, although the great firm theory was highly convincing, although disputed, Professor Leonard had not been able to find an archive which would actually attest to this process whereby the great firms, so to say, the family firms, would in fact detach themselves from one regime and then attach themselves to another. And you, I won't say found that archive, you reconstructed that archive through a process far more complex and challenging than you have allowed yourself in the little presentation. Given your, if we even admit your tremendous ability as a historian and allow for that, even so, here is my first kind of speculative question. So in this case, we are able to tell the story of detachment and reattachment of this capitalist lineage, if you like. How far is this process replicable, do you think? Because as I read your book, again and again, I feel this sense of longing and wonder whether this can be replicated, among other things, for example, for the House of Jagat Seth, about whom, of course, the Professor Jagannath Sarkar had written in relation to, the decline of the successor state of the Bengal Nawabs and their replacement by the East India Company. Of course, there was a narrative that was presented by Jagannath Sarkar, purely based on Persian sources in that case, so nowhere as rich as what you have done. But indeed, that story breaks off. So to what extent is there serendipity involved? To what extent is this possible to actually replicate again and again and test out your thesis is one thought that's kind of coming to my mind. In that connection, I also am wondering once again, and you underlined this fact, about the fact that this lineage, this eminently wealthy lineage, did not create or retain a repository of documents for itself. And I'm quite struck by that because I had a thesis in my mind that landed lineages, and in my mind, those were the majority. Again, I was mistaken, but landed wealthy lineages did did preserve documentation, which recorded their entitlements, their negotiations with the state, as well as people they were contracting with further down the political and social ladder, also their equals and so on. Why do you think this lineage did not maintain uh, a body of documentation? Or do you see signs on the other hand that they might have done so, but that collection was dispersed in a certain fashion? In that connection, also, let me ask you a little bit about self-representation. And this, I hope, is a more generous question in the sense that you are already engaged with this, including from the cover of your book, where you have this beautiful, evocative depiction of a member of this of the key protagonist family, as depicted on the walls of a temple that they had endowed. But the rest of the book, which does many other magnificent things, tells us less about their self-representation in terms of the everyday. So one often thinks of the Jain bankers of today as vegetarian, a very strictly vegetarian, also not eating root vegetables and so on. But in this case, we're actually talking about a very cosmopolitan lineage who are interacting with a host of different social groups, including later on with these mercenary Muslim soldiers who are referred to as the Arabs, and on the other hand, with later Mughal functionaries and so on. So one really wonders, can you trace a little bit more about their self-representation in the more everyday sense? Is that even possible? And that would be simply, to use a term which is about eating, that would be simply so delicious to actually see how people in fact live their wealth, so to say. So, because in our mind now, everybody will recognize the Ambani wedding. And I have been telling my students that if you wanted to actually get a feel, perhaps, of what a Mughal wedding was like, maybe you need to look at representations of the Ambani wedding. But am I wrong? Is there actually a different way of celebrating wealth as opposed to celebrating power that derives from other sources? And talking of wealth and power, and as you point out in the third of your four conceptual stages that you talk about, when the state functionaries, because of the crisis in the Mughal regime, actually become predatory and try to extract large amounts of money, first through persuasion and then through outright violence from members of this capitalist family farm. And what struck me actually is that there is something iconic that happens in this moment of being summoned to court and then beaten in public court, and the humiliation of such, and that itself is almost like a moral tale. You know that the regime will fall because it has actually gone that steps too far. In my mind, that clicked exactly with the urban legend, at least, which Jadunath Sarkar did reproduce in connection with that other banking house that I've just mentioned, which is the Jagat Seth's banking house, in which a young, ill-advised Nawab, the Sirajuddaulah, had again apparently demanded a huge loan, and having failed to receive it, had slapped the Jagat Seth in court. And that was the moment, it's again kind of narrated in this fashion, which predicted the inevitable tragic outcome for that regime. So I wonder whether there is a series of tropes one sees in this as well. This is not to deny the facticity of that episode, but I wonder if that performance is somehow a narrative element. And two more quick questions and then I wrap up because I'm just, I'm in the spirit of tell me more because this is just so wonderful. I also noted, like in the kind of ending section of the book, we don't actually have a tragic narrative in this case. We actually have a success narrative in which the regime that eventually emerges, while being, which is that of the Gaikwads of Baroda, who first replace the kind of the predatory governors of the Mughals and are themselves financially embarrassed and entangled with these capitalist firms themselves. But then they sort of turn themselves around and then they become the capitalists themselves. And I wondered, like, what is it about the Gaekwads that they're able to turn into bankers themselves? I mean, the Marathas do not come, I mean, for the worst form of ethnic determinism, if one even tried that, but the Marathas come from a social background which is martial and landed. And what is it that turns them into a good banker, as the East India Company observers call them? And finally, I was wondering, is there any connection between these Gujarati entrepreneurial families who seem not to quite decline in the most precipitous way that the Bengali entrepreneurial, as in the entrepreneurial families in Bengal declined in the 18th century, but they have continued as in success, as you have pointed out. Is there any connection between these families and the ones that basically become the financial agents of the Sultan of Zanzibar in the 19th century that Fahad Bishar has written about? Or is that a completely different zone, as in that is Kutch, and Kutch is a completely different region which rises in connection with East African trade and, of course, the kind of the penetration of the African continent for ivory and for enslaved human beings. So I was just wondering, is there any connection or it's a completely different sphere that rises? But with all of that, let me just sum it up by saying once again, Sudev, what a thrill it is that this book is out in the world. And it's such a joy to be teaching it to students and to be learning new things every time I open it up. Thank you.
So I'll just jump right in. Oh, Doug.
No, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Doug. Thank you so much, Sudev, for inviting me to be a discussant, for me to have this, to be part of this conversation with you and Nandini. So I come to this book as a curious outsider. I am not trained in Mughal studies, although I try to follow as an outsider. And just to let people know, I'm also a co-organizer of a series of comparative empires conference that both Nandini and Sudev are a part of. So it was also in that spirit that I read this book. And I should apologize because I only read it once. But I feel like this is a book I need to read 2 or 3 times, and I will be actually assigning it in a course I'm teaching in the spring. So I look forward to that. So let me start with some comments. And in my comments, there are some questions as well, but I also have just 2 or 3 questions at the end. So some things that struck me in terms of method. The languages, yes. So there's a similar movement in the Ottoman field as well. In an earlier generation, it was thought that, Arabic, Persian, Turkish, that's all you needed. But no, recently there's a move, you need what we call local, but actually they were also imperial languages, Greek, the Balkan languages, Hebrew, Armenian, Ladino, so many. So that's the next sort of frontier. And as your own book relied on Sanskrit, Gujarati, Marathi, in addition to Persian and other languages, and even within Persian, the fiscal documents you use a very particular siyak, right? Similar to the Ottoman fiscal ones. That is amazing. And in a sense, as an Ottoman is seeing that, I'm seeing what could be, what the next generation of Ottoman research might look like when we are able to tap these local sources. So next point, both the micro and the macro. So there were just details that astounded me, and I just put some here, even as small as you gave that in your presentation, but with people who are suffering from famine selling their children for 2 rupees each, and footnote 5 on page 181, 1 rupee for 10 kg of wheat in this period. And I was just thinking, oh, okay, like off the top of my head, I don't have those numbers for the Ottoman case, and I was thinking what kind of work I'll need to do to get those purchasing power stuffs. Chalani rupees, referring to Mughal coins minted in previous years that remained in currency as a crucial form of small change. So as somebody who's trying to start a new project on monetary history in the Ottoman Empire, and I think I have read 80% of the secondary literature. So that granularity of what you can see from, as in what is something I'm like, oh, okay. I better make sure I've gotten all the scans I need for the secondary literature. So at the micro level, that attention to detail was something throughout the whole book was something that struck me, and as well the different rights to land tenure, chapter 6, which we will get to later. It's another comment. Moving from the micro to the big picture macro. So the how this story uh, harmonizes with global systemic trends towards increasing financialization and the growing insolvency of state administration in early modern times. I quote, and how you built that up and connected to bigger arguments by Immanuel Wallerstein, Victor Lieberman, and put the Mughal story at that level, the way a family history or family histories could speak to these bigger stories of histories of capitalism or financialization of state formation. That was very impressive to me. Praise for the case study itself. I mean, as you mentioned in your presentation as well, uh, and myself as an Ottomanist, I always look with envy towards the European field with their family histories and their archives. And I was trying to think also of any equivalent in the Ottoman, in something that goes back, to the 16th century to the 18th. And off the top of my head, I thought maybe just Bashar Dumani's work from Brown, where he does use family papers, and these are local families in Nablus in Palestine. But yeah, but like what you said, the Rothschilds, I can't. There must be in that recent comment by Nandini as well, talking about constructing the archive, or why might a prominent lineage not leave documentation, or was that documentation dispersed? That's also questions that I've been thinking about in the Ottoman case. So now two last comments, two D words, okay, delegation and decline. So it was interesting for me to read your views on the chain of deputies, Farhad Hassan's idea of chain of deputies. I quote, what proliferation of shares in imperial sovereignty, which took the form of sub-infeudation of officers through a chain of deputies. We have a very similar quote by Molly Green at Princeton University. She talks about the thickening of governance. And more people latching on to that thickening governance because more and more people rents, basically more and more people getting rents as and participating in governance by the 18th century, right? Bakitas John UC Davis also has observed that using different terms. His term is proto-democracy, So, but similar movements, similar patterns in the structure of imperial power at the local level that we're seeing. But at the same time, I think this is a call. As an Ottomanist reading that, I see the similar vocabulary, but it's a very different phenomenon, in my view, that's actually happening on the ground. Because you are seeing the deputyships as a symptom of imperial weakness. And the way you're describing the deputyships, where it's getting fuzzy, the chain of command is fuzzy, it's not clear who's in charge anymore, not just at the governor level, but even at the lower levels, there's confusion over whose jurisdiction is in charge, and that's not quite the case at this time in the Ottoman Empire. So this tells me that perhaps this is a call for a new set of theoretical frameworks of vocabulary for us to be more precise in actually articulating what's happening on the ground, because you can have, because basically there's a trade-off. When you want to get scale, you need to delegate. To be, a pre-modern empire is to rule. It is to rule indirectly. So indirect rule is the name of the game, right? But it's not so much the brute fact of intermediaries or the brute existence of delegates or deputies or intermediaries or local agents. It's actually the structure and how you organize, how tasks are actually delegated that affects outcomes, and that makes or breaks your attempt to scale up. So these are just some thoughts I had when I was reading your very detailed description of that collapse at a at a provincial level, and the commercialization of power, which is your argument, I think page 10. The commercialization of political power is one mode of that delegation, and it's only at one level of that delegation, right? It's at the Jhaveri level, but not everything below them. Or maybe, I mean, there are obviously money interests for everyone. Everyone's getting some like incentive, right? But that commercialization of power, that only applies to a certain level in that hierarchy, and that's one mode. But there's also the whole structure itself as it's transforming, whether the how it holds together. And I think that's actually where I see the Ottoman and Mughal pictures diverge. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't have all the words yet, but I think it's the beginning of us trying to coin a new way of talking about this. And that leads to the second D word, which is decline. So I think both our historiographies as well, the Ottoman and Mughal historiographies, have had our own, decline issues walking out of the terms and anything. So whatever we want to call it, decline, collapse, transformation, perhaps this is the call. What is more productive is we want the anatomy of it, of the decline or the not decline, whatever we're going to call it. We want to see that breakdown in slow motion and just go through, like a post-mortem vivisection, like how on earth. And what you cited to on page 230 by Tirthankar Roy, path dependency of shared sovereignty. I thought that was very interesting about how instead of agglomerating power, you're actually local power holders are incentivized to keep giving it away in order to forestall the need for military action, because they do the cost benefit or whatever, and they're like, okay, actually, it's better for me to just, give that away. And in a sense, competitive co-parcenary in some shades of it seems to me also like a fiscal counterpart to that predisposition, right? And so in the so this was something that I took with me. I have not fully stewed on it yet, but it makes me go back to the Odwin case, and I need to see. It makes me want to go back and see how if it resonates. So this is still under the point about the wanting the anatomy, right? The blow by blow anatomy of decline, of the collapse. And now the exciting part for me, which was tax farming, the taxonomy of tax farming, or the delegation of rights to land revenue. And you have on like page 278 all these different new kinds of land rights, from ijara, temporary, to jaidat, which is acknowledged revenue paid to third party. But then I think there's a typo here. This is just a small point. Vekania and Garenia, they actually the definitions for both is actually the same, right? Mortgaged by government to the village leader or patel in time of exceptional need, not recognized after 1827. They're both the same, but I suspect they're different. But so this also brings me to another point, which is that I think in both our historiographies, tax farming has also been sort of like the big bad thing that indicates loss of central power, blah, blah, blah. But I think maybe this is our generation or the next sort of frontier, which is actually no, tax farming is there's a whole world. There are different ways of delegating land revenue rights, right? And actually the interesting thing is in the different modes of that delegation and how that will change how your imperial collapse looks like, right? And I think that is where the Ottomans need to do their work as well. We have to, understand. And I feel when I read your work, I'm seeing, hey, no, that the land revenue, the land tenure thing, it continues to innovate, right? They are really milking and squeezing the whatever land rights they have to financialize and commodify it, like to extents that probably their granddads could not have imagined. So that continues to be a very lively field, and it's an injustice, it's a disservice to just like brush it all with one name, tax farming. So that's the those are these exciting things that your work has inspired me to think about when I go back to the Onmanist. And now, as for my questions, actually, my first question was similar to Nandini's. I was very curious about what's happening in the other parts of the Mughal Empire. Is this? I mean, this is the sort of like the question one always gets in any book talk is like, can you generalize this from Gujarat to the rest of the empire? What's happening? And I feel bad for even mentioning it, but I think I got a bit of an answer from Nandini's question. And my other two questions are easy ones. I noticed you've been giving book talks in different cities, different audiences in India. I was just curious about interesting audience responses, audience questions that you got in your different talks. And the third question is, what's your next project? Yes, thank you so much again for inviting me.
Okay, wow, thank
Thank you
you.
very much. I thought I had unmuted myself, but took two steps. So, Dave, do you want just a few minutes to respond to the comments? And so, don't take too long since we want to get into questions. We have one question already in the Q&A. So,
Okay, great. Um, yeah, I can definitely respond briefly to the nice comments that were offered by Nandini and Chunwi. So I will let me begin by saying something about the archive, because I think that will help us think about some of the questions that were already posed. I was recently in Ahmedabad and I met members of the Lauder family who are the descendants of the Jhaveris. And I learned that it's custom practice in the family to actually burn uh, documents and to burn materials that had been handed down. And they recounted their oral history, at least for the 20th century, in several instances where materials were found in the house, or they showed up through another branch of the family, and promptly the elders took a decision to get rid of those documents. Partly, a lot of that has to do with Jain views on not upturning or revisiting past deeds of souls who have departed or who are no longer around. So that is a short, almost an easy answer to why these materials don't exist, but that's only a partial answer. Some of other answers that I've come up with in the course of my research have to do with archives being dispersed as well, right? So, for example, the Vasiyatnama or the will of Shantidas Jhaveri, the banker who I'm studying in my book, is nowhere to be found in modern day India. It's actually held in the National Museum in Karachi. We also have some other documents that are scattered in small libraries across. So there may have been a period where some of this material was organized in some kind of central repository, but it's clearly scattered and it's found its way into different libraries. So that could be another reason for why that's the case. We know from 18th century accounts that one of the first things local Mughal governors did, especially in early 18th century, was ransack archives. So we also have that history and that legacy to contend with, which is the first thing you do as a political leader when you arrive into a city that you want to kind of control is you go to the Divan's office, and you kind of scatter all the materials that you have. Obviously, that's the Mughal archive, not the family archive. But you see that, practices around documenting and preserving are very different than what we may have for, let's say, a prominent business family in Europe. I was very saddened to hear about burning of materials, and I told the family that if they find anything, please save it and don't burn it. But they really feel strongly about that. And frankly speaking, from their point of view, there are things in these materials that they didn't want people to look at. So, for example, we have actually stories of early 20th century relationship between this family and the national movement for independence. We have post 1950s, Nehruvian state, closed economy level documents that the family has preserved, and those were also burned in the 1980s, largely because of inquiries around taxes and government inquiries around what the family's possessions are, especially when it comes to landed resources. So that's the short end of that. And I think that's why it's so difficult to do business history in South Asia, and in India in particular. Now, let me say something about merchants, business families, and geographical spread. This kind of alludes to Nandini's question around Kachi merchants, but also might say something more about the subcontinent. In the course of my research, when I first started out, I was very tempted to subscribe to the idea that merchants, bankers, financiers, they're all part of kind of a central class, and we can talk about them in the same way. What I learned through researching this book is that we actually have to be very attuned to not only spatial dynamics. So, for example, hinterland merchants like the Jhaveris are very different than coastal merchants like Virji Vora, for example, who was a very prominent Mughal merchant, happened to be in Surat, which was much more plugged into Indian Ocean trade and mercantile activity through oceanic ports. And then the second set of distinctions we have to make is between typologies of business. So you might be a jeweler, and that might be very different than, let's say, plying the trade in indigo as a commodity. That might be also different than being someone involved in the minting of money. Chunwi, you nicely referred to my discussion on rupees. That was a whole nother enterprise altogether, which is to say that this was a world that operated under commodity currency. Even though the emperor's sovereign stamp was on these coins, people still assayed the coins for how valuable the intrinsic metal was, right? So again, it was a very different world of operating. And what I learned is that these merchants were very different. So on the one hand, I'm tempted to say that, yeah, maybe we could find replicable cases for this particular family, but that would also be a big leap because, again, the type of businesses that they were involved in might be very different than what was happening in Surat, which is not that far away from Ahmedabad, let alone Bengal, which is very far away. What does emerge, though, by way of commonality, is that by the 18th century, we do see, just like we see with Jagat Seth in Bengal, that offering cash and offering capital and offering resources, especially on the spot when it's needed, is a very lucrative business. And this is something that is emerging as a political resource. So cash and capital needed immediately is a very important resource in contrast to an earlier period where, for example, you needed very entrepreneurial, gutsy soldiers who were willing to partake in military campaigns with the promise of booty and war spoils at the end of conquest, right? So, like, again, it's a very different conceptualization for what money and resources actually mean to someone. So what is common though is that by the 18th century, we see this across the board, at least in Bengal and Gujarat, where we have evidence that's much more robust, Punjab a little bit as well, where financial resources and being able to loan money is something that is new and that's something that people are latching onto. Similarly, we also see the extortion of these merchants, just like you mentioned with the Jagat Seth family, emerging in this time period too. It is partly a trope, yes, but I also have seen, at least in the case of Gujarat, we have 4 or 5 different language accounts of this kind of dynamic happening on the ground. So you have Persian accounts documenting this, you have local diaries documenting this, you have Gujarati poems by urban poets who are not patronized by any political organization or any banking family, who are also noticing these bankers becoming more prominent. And in fact, in the case of Gujarat, they're being written about in kind of an ambivalent way. They're sort of being written about as, are they really on our side, these local Gujarati bankers, or are they really against us? We're not quite sure, these Jhaveris, who they actually are. So it's not to say that these bankers were entirely victims. Certainly not. I hope no one walks away from this talk feeling sorry for these bankers. They were actually hedging bets and they were very much Janus faced. And the local sources captured this ambivalence in amazing, amazing detail. So that's what I have to say about that in terms of replicability. I mean, I think we need a lot more work on banking families and lineages across the subcontinent. If we can find the materials, especially for Jain families, as I said, the practice of burning materials makes it very difficult to access this world. But I think there's still work to be done. And I think the range of literary sources that we have I've only tapped into a small percentage of it. I'm hoping that other people will step up and offer their thoughts too. Let me say a couple of quick things about some of the other questions that were offered, and then we can open it up to Q&A. I think this question about um, about money and about the precision with which, I've been able to cite other people's work in my book has a lot to do with an earlier generation of scholars who we're very thankful for, who did painstaking work in reconstructing Mughal economy. It's a different matter altogether that some scholars recently, such as Sumit Guha, for example, would even doubt the veracity of such claims, right? And we are kind of, when you're writing a book and when you're kind of imagining a world, there's some fictions that you're buying into wholeheartedly. And I think one of the fictions I bought into wholeheartedly was this earlier generation of scholarly work on the Mughal economy, which again is a robust range of work by multiple scholars, right? But again, we do have revisionist views saying that, I don't know, are those junk statistics? Do they actually mean anything? Um, and it's tempting to fall into that trap too, right? Of like, well, what does all of this mean? Maybe nothing. So what I will say though is that what's new, and I think what's curious for our purposes, is that post 1600, metallic money emerges as a very new technology of control. And it's something that is new for South Asia as a subcontinent. You had Jain mint masters, you had some forms of currency being used early on, no doubt. But the influx of New World silver post 1600 is a massive change for the subcontinent. So it's not that bankers are contending with it. The Mughals are also contending with this new technology and are trying to figure out how can we use this as an instrument of control. And the best thing that they identify is that, look, the minting of coins and the circulation of these coins will leave more or less independent. As long as we demarcate our taxes in a silver currency, we will let the market dictate how these coins are going to be used. And it is in this same context that by the early 18th century, book money emerges as a new technology too, right? So like one thing which I don't think I explicitly kind of outlined so clearly in my book, but now that I think about, I probably should have, is that there are new technologies emerging at every major kind of imperial formation or every political change. Nandini also nicely mentioned the Gaikwads emerging as bankers in the 18th, really the 19th century, is also another frontier in this, right? So in some ways, you shouldn't separate new forms of money technology and new forms of enumeration and accounting from political power per se. And I think that, that's something I'm still thinking about. I don't have a final word on that, but I think it's very, very key. The last thing I'll say about Nandini's point is why did the Gaikwads emerge as bankers in their own right? Well, the East India Company has a big role to play in this. The Marathas and the early Gaikwads are actually seen as very poor administrators by a range of sources. And what the Gaikwads do very astutely is in the process of tax farming, they start amassing their own personal wealth, which is separate from the state's wealth. So here you get, again, a new movement, which is unlike Mughal times, which is the separation of sovereign wealth at the state level from that of the emperor or of the king or of the Raja who has their own privy purse. And it was only when the East India Company threatened Gaikwads by saying, look, you're financially insolvent, we're going to take over Gaikwad territory, that the Gaikwad said, wait a minute, we actually have our own private privy purse that we've been accounting from over the last 3 or 4 decades. Why don't we just tap into that private purse? We'll pay you off, and you can still allow us to retain our own sovereign space, so to speak. So again, a very new technology, a new way of thinking about money emerges in this time period too. And that's something that I still haven't figured out. I mean, the book is just the first word, but I really think that this is one thing that I hope to do next at some point in the future. And then quickly about my future projects, I'm actually thinking about Ahmedabad city as a place I'd like to explore over a longer period of time, because what I found is that the city might be the most interesting way or the most interesting landscape, the most interesting artifact to start exploring different forms of sovereignty over a longer period of time. You have different forms of imprint on the city that might, allow us to explore politics and power in a very different way. So I'm hoping that I can work on Ahmedabad city in a long durée kind of fashion. And I think business families would be kind of one node in thinking about that, but so would art and architecture, so would urban poetry, and so would many other kind of ways of thinking about the city over time. So I know I have a lot more to say, but maybe I'll leave it for Q&A if there are Q&A. But I'll stop there. Thanks, Doug.
Okay. We have thank you very much, everyone, for the comments and your responses, Sudev. We have one question right now in the Q&A. Um, uh,
I see it. Yeah.
this is from Nina Vij from Central University of Jammu. And she said she'd been reading about the entrepreneurial successes of royal Mughal women, and she'd like your opinion
Oh
on
boy.
that subject.
So I have not studied royal women in any great detail. Maybe Nandini has more to say about this, but all I can say is that, we know for sure that elite Mughal women, people like Nur Jahan, Jahanara Begum, they were substantial landowners and they managed kind of vast jagirs, land grants, and they actually had their own wealth through such alienation of landed rights. We also know that they patronized trade at some level, right? So, for example, I believe there are accounts of Jahanara Begum developing Shah Jahanabad, which is Old Delhi, and owning actually some of her own sort of trade emporiums in this time period too. We also know that they had their own textile karkhanas and craft karkhanas through which they accumulated substantial wealth as well. They also sort of patronized architecture and urban development in their environments. Of course, literary and aesthetic investments were made by these women as well. But I have not studied royal women in any sustained fashion, so I would maybe ask Nandini if she wants to say something she can, or point you to the work of Ruby Lal and others who have written and really studied this aspect of Mughal history, which is important. I will say for the bankers, we know very little about the female members of the Jhaveri household, unfortunately. That's a huge gap that we have in our knowledge from that perspective too.
Shall I
Yes,
jump
please.
in and
Go ahead.
say, Sudev, that possibly you have covered everything that we do know from the secondary literature about royal women, on whom I haven't worked as well. But there is one tidbit that might be interesting to the audience. There is something I came across somewhere, which is that the difficulty in conciliation with Shivaji, the Maratha Empire builder, um, that Aurangzeb faced was that Jahanara Begum was particularly upset about the raid on Surat, because that was in her Jagir. And I haven't actually verified this, but it struck me as it can very much be like Orientalist urban legend, but it struck me as something very interesting that that might be the case. I always wondered how it was reconciled that these royal women actually held Jagirs and what was the logic of that. Since they could not, for under the Mughals, you did have to perform some kind of state service, and it was always coded as military. So I always wondered how these kind of women Jagir holders were rationalized, and I haven't come across anything like this.
It would be amazing if we found evidence of them having military entourages or patronizing them in their own way. I mean, it's quite possible that they did have that, but we just don't have the evidence for it.
So, Dev, you and I do know that, in fact, even if she did not have a regular entourage, Nur Jahan, the Empress, did at a certain point, in a very difficult point of time, was able to mobilize several Rajput regiments very,
Yeah.
very successfully. So
Yes,
there's,
absolutely.
yeah.
Can I read the next question, Doug, if that's
Oh,
okay?
yeah. The next question was from an anonymous attendee who was intrigued by the discussion of the Ambani
Yeah.
wedding in the Mughals, and the attendee would love to hear the findings from this book, how the findings from this book could inform popular narratives of the Mughals' wealth and political power in contemporary India. He
Okay.
also wondered if your interest in Mughal decline had anything to do with the imperial posturing of Hindu nationalism that you might have been witnessing while you were in Delhi.
Okay, both heavy questions. So, um, if we leave all the technical details of the book aside, I did learn something quite interesting about prominent business families over a long period of time. And that is simply this, that without political patronage and without a keen eye to political developments, you couldn't hope for your family business surviving beyond a generation or two. And the Javeris were very keen about this. And they paid attention to political developments, not only by providing their own capital and resources, but by, at least from what I know from the family history and even oral history, is always being attuned to the kind of industries they could partake in, which would be, sort of high value, high return, but not necessarily in competition with the state. So, for example, the Jhaveris in their modern iteration in the 20th century have refrained from petrochemicals or coal, for example, even though they have the resources and wealth to do so, because they know that that is a very dangerous kind of industry to tap into. I also know from the family history is that each generation has pivoted substantially from their forefathers and foreparents' businesses. So the idea that there is immense continuity over time and that businesses and wealth and knowledge is passed down in a kind of linear fashion is just not true. Each family generation has pivoted substantially. If you look at even the Jhaveri early history, you go from being jewelers to political financiers to becoming paymasters of the military to then financing revenue farms. That's four generations and four different businesses altogether. And then by the 19th century, which I don't go into in my book, the family enters cotton trading and then finally enters early industry, right, which is textiles. And this is something that continues in the 20th century. So, yes, big families pivot, and those that don't pivot often find themselves in dire straits. And that's something that I learned from this particular family as well. I actually have an interview with the current managing director of the family business, Sanjay Lalbhai. It's available online through Harvard Business School. It's free for the public. And he discusses quite candidly his family's relationship to politics and the wisdom that was given to him by his grandparents about how to navigate political turmoil. So the family's still $1 billion conglomerate. Clearly, they're doing something right. Now, as far as my own interest, I would say that my interest in the Mughals really came from the kind of imaginative lectures that were given to me when I was a student in Delhi by Najaf Haider and many other scholars who I had a chance to kind of meet and interact with. And the kind of construction of this amazing bygone era, I'm not going to lie, I'm still kind of a Mughal-phile, in the sense that I do kind of sometimes imagine what it's like to live in a court setting, or what it would be like to kind of engage in imperial feasting and be part of the tall tales that we have of the Mughal Empire. And I think you need to have that kind of love for that time period to kind of embark on a project like this. But in all seriousness, when it comes to kind of Hindu nationalism and thinking about how people remember history, I think, in Gujarat, when I've done ethnographic work, when I've met the families, when I've talked to businesses, they have a much more nuanced understanding of the past and are much more willing to admit that they were very close and connected to sources of political power, whether Mughal or not. So I think the religious angle or the kind of nationalist angle is something that is much more popular. But if you talk to the family, they say, and they take great pride, for example, in Shah Jahan calling Shantidas Jhaveri Mama, using kinship terms. We don't have evidence for whether that was true or not, but the family remembers it as such, right? And I think that if anything, this book and this narrative helps us see that, they had much more cosmopolitan lives than our own lives. We live in an age of internet and in an age of kind of access, but they operated in multiple linguistic registers. They operated in multiple cultural registers, and I think that the family had a very close association with the Mughals. So, if anything, a book like this challenges kind of popular perceptions that these were two separate groups, that the Mughals were invaders and outsiders. I would say that no, that's not the case. They built their families in the subcontinent. They built alliances and lineages in the subcontinent, and the local elites, like the Jhaveris, for example, partook in that as well. So that's a very, very important part of my story as well. Looks like there's like two quick ones. Can I
Yeah,
ask
two quick questions, and
Yeah.
I think we've got 2 minutes left
Yeah.
to answer them. One is about the religious identities
Yeah.
of the various
So quickly about
players.
the religious identities, what I found is that intra-Jain rivalries. So, for example, the rivalry between a Jain silk merchant and a Jain jeweler in Ahmedabad was probably more tense and more divided and more acrimonious than, for example, the relationship between the Jains overall and the Mughals, right? So again, intra-community rivalry is often stronger than what we might think of as macro religious fault lines. Tejaswini has a question about textiles. Um, would they have been involved in financing film production? Oh, that's interesting. So probably not this family, and I know that based on their oral history as well, but it is quite possible that the early families in Mumbai may have had that connection to the film industry. But in Ahmedabad, What's unique is that we know that the Jhaveris were very much involved in funding Gandhi's nationalist movement in the early 20th century. We have a lot of letters written by Gandhi to Kasturba Lal Bey, who is the member of the Jhaveri family, asking for funds, asking for resources to contribute to the nationalist cause. So at least from that perspective, we know the families continued with, paying keen attention to political developments, and the nationalist movement in the 20th century is the most recent iteration of that in the 20th century.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sudev. We won't have time to uh, answer the question, but it really struck me as I was thinking about my earlier reading of this that so much of the literature on the Mughals has been focused on decline, and this is a very rich picture of that. But I wonder if it's possible to create a picture of how the Mughals constructed their tremendous power in the first place, so they didn't need to rely on merchants and others. This seems to have happened fairly quickly, and so on. So I'll leave you with that question. Maybe we
Okay,
can
great.
discuss it at some other time. But
Thank you.
realize that the historiography doesn't talk so much about the consolidation of Mughal power and its relationship to local elites of various sorts. But overall, I think, if I'm correct, we end at 1:30. So we have to close here now. And thank you to all our participants, Nandini, Chunwi, and especially to Sudev. And thank you all to the Bodas Fellows and to Hope Renee as well. With
Thank
that,
you very much for having
we
me.
need to close. Bye-bye.
Lavia, can we stop recording, please?
Hello? Yeah, I'm going to stop the recording right now.
Thank you.
Got it, I think. Wait, did I?